questions, okay? So Danny Murillo was awarded a Soros Justice Advocacy Fellowship in 2016. These awards give financial support to outstanding individuals, lawyers, advocates, grassroots organizers, to undertake criminal justice reform projects at the local, state, and national levels. Can you hear me okay? Murillo's project was to empower formerly incarcerated students by creating a network of people throughout California who have successfully made the transition from incarceration to higher education. In New Jersey, Murillo was a counselor with Rutgers University's STEP program. He graduated from UC Berkeley in 2015 with a degree in ethnic studies. As Ronald E. McNair Scholar, he conducted research on the disproportionate rate of suspension of Black male students in Oakland high schools, public schools. As an intern at the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights, he researched the economic impact of incarceration on communities of color. Also, while at UC Berkeley, he did a lot, he co-founded the Underground Scholars Initiative, an organization dedicated to supporting students who have been personally impacted by incarceration. He's now with Opportunity Institute, which he will tell you about.
Thank you, Joan, and thanks for coming out to talk about solitary confinement. In thinking about solitary confinement in the California prisons, it's important to put that particular abuse of human rights in the context of the really extraordinary increase in incarceration and harsh criminal penalties that really took place throughout this country beginning in the 1980s. And one of the aspects of that increased incarceration was the development of so-called supermax prisons, particularly beginning in the federal prisons. And there are two notorious supermax prisons in the federal system. One is in Colorado, the other is in Marion, Illinois. And at least to listen to prison officials talk about it, these prisons are reserved for people who are, quote unquote, the worst of the worst, a danger to fellow prisoners, to correctional staff, and so on. And the conditions in the supermax prisons are incredibly harsh. And the most harsh thing about them is the isolation that people who are imprisoned suffer. Typically in their cells, which are the size of a small bathroom, for 22, 23, 24 hours a day, no human contact whatsoever, no visiting, no interaction among prisoners, not even any real interaction with correctional officers, because typically the way people are fed in the supermax prisons is through a slot in their door. When they're allowed out for showers or cleanliness, hygiene activities, typically allowed out one at a time. The doors open automatically. The person goes out into the hallway. A door to a shower room opens. They go into the shower. They take a shower and return. And physical activity, which theoretically occurs for an hour a day, but often occurs less frequently than that, is again in a very isolated situation where they cannot converse with anyone and certainly not have any physical contact with anyone else. The idea of solitary confinement began to take hold in California. Two of the 35 or so state prisons in California had what they call security housing units called SHUs, where people were kept in solitary confinement. One is at Tehachapi. The first one is at Tehachapi, which is a very run-down, dilapidated prison, literally up on Tehachapi Pass when you come out of the Los Angeles basin to the Mojave Desert. And the other is at a prison called Corcoran, which is kind of down Highway 5, closer to Bakersfield than Fresno. Then in 1989, California opened its supermax prison called Pelican Bay, which is in Pelican Bay in the extreme northwest corner of the state. It's a really contradictory place. If you've been up to Crescent City or up along the coast, it's a beautiful part of California. The ocean is there, it's green, there are great beaches, but once you go through the gates of Pelican Bay State Prison, you would have no idea that you were in a beautiful place. It seems to be organized in a way so that there's literally not a blade of grass that grows on the grounds. Everything is either asphalt or pebbles. And the facilities, there is both a SHU there, which is really what we're going to be talking about, and there's also a regular prison there where prisoners have something resembling a real life and contact with each other and activities. But the SHU itself is, it's bizarrely hygienic. You know, I mean, there is nothing when you walk into this place that reminds you of anything resembling human contact, right? There's no art, there are no magazines, there's no anything for the prisoners. You walk in and they are imprisoned in these cells, in cell blocks. As I said earlier, there's literally no human contact. Meals are served on trays through slots. Bathroom breaks are isolated. The place where the prisoners exercise are in these three-walled, almost like rooms, but there's exposure to air on one side, but when you look out that way, that's all you see is the side of the prison, and prisoners are allowed to go out there for an hour at a time, several days a week, with literally nothing to do except walk back and forth like rats in a cage. There's no exercise equipment, there's no basketball hoop or anything. So people are kept in there for years and years and years, some for over 30 years, if you can imagine that. Some of the prisoners who came there in 1989 when Pelican Bay was opened had already been in solitary at Corcoran or Tehachapi. So life goes on, very, very brutal place. In fast forward to 2011, two prisoners in Pelican Bay, Todd Ashker and Danny Troxel, brought a lawsuit. And they brought it on their own, filed it in federal court, challenging the conditions of their confinement. At the same time, what was going on in what is called the Short Corridor, which is one of the housing areas at Pelican Bay, there begins to be, over a long period of time, communication among several prisoners who were on the Short Corridor, prisoners from different ethnic and racial groups who ultimately learned to communicate by passing kites to each other. A kite is a little tiny folded up piece of paper. Prisoners become very adept at moving these things from one cell to another, throwing it out on the floor. Someone can reach out with a piece of string or something that might resemble a coat hanger, and they circulate that way. And contrary to the plans of the prison officials, these prisoners actually began to develop personal and political unity. Most of the people in solitary in California prisons at that time were in it not because they had done anything bad. They're, of course, in prison because they've been convicted of a crime, but they were in solitary because they were alleged to be members of gangs, okay? Security threat groups is what they're called in prison parlance. And they were in solitary for indefinite periods of time, and I want to stress, not because of any conduct, not because they had hurt another prisoner or hurt a guard or anything like that, but because they're found to be members of prison gangs. And prison gangs are Latino groups, African American groups, and white groups. And historically, these groups of people didn't like each other. So the prison officials decided in this short corridor to put a group of people they understood to be leaders of these different groups, with the thought that this would even create further isolation, because the understanding was these people didn't like each other. But thanks to the efforts of a couple of them, particularly Todd Ashker and a man named Sitawa, who's an African-American man from Oakland, they began to develop conversations, and they developed a pretty high level of very progressive political unity. And the Aryan Brotherhood, the white group, is basically neo-Nazis, right? And the African Americans are, if not familial descendants, political descendants of George Jackson and prisoners who were associated with the Black Panther Party in the 1970s. So these are not exactly groups of people who were destined to be friends, but they became friends and they became political allies. So as I mentioned earlier, in 2011, Ashker and another member of the Aryan Brotherhood filed a lawsuit, and at the same time they began to develop this political unity, and in 2011 there was the first hunger strike to protest the conditions of solitary confinement. It was primarily at Pelican Bay, but others joined it around the state. Maybe as many as 5,000 or 6,000 participated in a hunger strike for a while. Prison officials were very freaked out about this. They wanted to see it ended. They offered concessions. Concession, for example, being allowed to have a hat, a wool-like ski cap, a beanie, so that you could keep warm, or giving people actually plastic cups so that they could have their coffee or their instant noodles or soup. Previously, you used a cut-off part of a little milk carton as your cup. I mean, things are that deprived in solitary confinement. The hunger strike ended. Not a whole lot was accomplished. But then what happened is that a group of attorneys, led by an organization called the Center for Constitutional Rights, which is based in New York City and has been around since the civil rights days and has done, it's kind of, in my view, it's a more progressive version of the American Civil Liberties Union. It really takes on cutting-edge litigation around prison issues, education issues. It's taken the lead in fighting the conditions at Guantanamo, things like that. CCR became interested in the lawsuit and ultimately put together a legal team which consisted of at least a dozen, maybe as many as 20 lawyers from CCR, from small groups in the Bay Area, including my law firm, and legal advocates of prisoners with children, Prison Focus, and so on. And they were looking around for a legal vehicle to use to challenge solitary confinement, and they heard about the Ashker case and spoke with Todd and Danny and asked if they would be amenable to having representation by this group of attorneys, and whether they would also be open to the idea that the lawsuit would be expanded to include plaintiffs from both the African American group as well as different Latino groups. As you may know or maybe don't know, within the California system, they divide Latino prisoners depending mainly upon geography, but also based upon organizations that they're allegedly part of. So there were Southern Mexicans and Northern Mexicans who became plaintiffs in the lawsuit, as well as African Americans and the Aryan Brotherhood. And the case really took off very energetically with the leadership of CCR and my spouse, Ann Wiles, and several other attorneys, and began to accumulate evidence regarding the practices that led people into solitary confinement, as well as what was wrong with it. For example, the Juan Mendez, who is the United Nations raconteur on torture, issued a report in which he concluded that solitary confinement is torture, and that being in solitary for as short a period of time as a week can actually lead to mental deterioration and the development of mental illnesses. And this is a pretty widely held opinion by psychologists and psychiatrists. And so a big legal team was added or increased by experts on prison issues and as well as psychology and so on. And a group of prisoners were interviewed by these doctors who issued very serious expert reports. And then in 2013, there was another hunger strike. And this one involved 30,000 prisoners from around the state, which is at that time about 25% of the prison population in California. And I'm sure some of you who lived around here then were aware of it through media reports and so on. It was extremely big deal, and it completely freaked out the prison officials to see prisoners all over the state striking and to have all the public attention. That led to hearings in the state legislature. Lonnie Hancock, as you know from this area, was one of the people who led those hearings. There were some initiatives, statutory initiatives, introduced to limit solitary confinement. None of them really went anywhere. The governor's office and legislative leadership was really not particularly interested in the rights of prisoners, but because of the strike, the public attention, the attention from the legislature, ultimately the state decided to come to the negotiating table in 2015, and as a result of months of very arduous negotiations, I mean, these people are not particularly nice. I mean, I just have to say that. And they don't really have a lot of empathy or compassion for prisoners. They're viewed as bad people. But the reality of it is that as a group, they're really anything but, right? I mean, I interviewed people, Ann and I would going up to Pelican Bay almost on a weekly basis in 2013 during the hunger strike and afterwards. And you get to know these guys, and you get to know them pretty well, and talk to a person who might be 65 years old, and he's been in the SHU because he robbed a grocery store 25 years previous. But because he is alleged to be a gang member, he's in the SHU instead of just a regular prison, and the state parole agency has an unwritten but firm practice of not paroling prisoners who are being held in solitary. So you're basically in there for life. And you talk to this man, and he would say, you know, I want nothing more in life than to be able to visit with my grandchildren and hold them on my lap. I mean, and that's, you know, the kind of pathos that you experience in dealing with these people. It definitely brings you to tears. But they agreed to finally, under tremendous pressure, to change solitary confinement, and they made two most dramatic changes. The first change they made is that they agreed that you would not be placed in solitary confinement based solely on alleged gang membership or association, okay? And that was the most important change. Previously, you could be placed in solitary and a finding made of gang membership and association based on 3 source items. And a source item could be something like, literally, this is not at all an exaggeration, you had a George Jackson book in your cell. And by the way, you know, prisoners can buy books, and as long as they come from Amazon or someone that the prison system trusts. So a prisoner could order a George Jackson book on Amazon, it comes to the prison, it's in his cell, and then it's used as a basis to validate that prisoner is a gang member. Another source item could be if you made a sketch, and it was a sketch of, say, an Aztec symbol or something like that, and the prison people say, well, this is a gang indicia. If you happen to be a Hispanic prisoner, that's a gang indicia. Or an anonymous tip from another prison. So-and-so is a gang member. Those are 3, a book, a sketch, a gossipy rumor, or a poem that you wrote, or a list of people you wrote as your friends, or you're giving a greeting to someone if you're being marched to the library or someplace where you actually can encounter another prisoner. The African Americans in particular were incredibly isolated within the SHU at Pelican Bay because there are not a lot of them. And so there might be one African American per corridor. They would never see another African American. And if they were let out, taken to the library or to the infirmary for a visit, and they saw someone they knew or knew of and waved to that person, that could be an indicia of gang membership. So the most significant change that was made is that now you can only be in the SHU for an act that you commit in prison and only for a discrete term. And secondly, there has to be an opportunity to challenge your sentence to the SHU in a process which few of us would recognize particularly as a due process proceeding, but which is at least some proceeding where you could challenge the evidence that's being offered against you. And so, in my view, and then I'll stop, I think that we did make considerable progress, maybe even extraordinary progress, as a result of the lawsuit, the hunger strike, public opinion, all coming together to put pressure on the prison system, and some changes in leadership of the prison system under Governor Brown, which has been positive. But there's slippage, and people are no longer put in, quote, SHU, but they have other types of isolating and isolated housing situations for people. Sometimes they will claim that someone is under threat by other prisoners, so he has to be isolated. But those conditions are not quite as severe. For example, people in these isolated units may have yard where they can interact with other prisoners. Sometimes, you know, it's bizarre. Sometimes prisoners who are in yard are what are called walk-alone cages. So there's a series of cages, and they are literally cages, but there's at least a bunch of them out there in the yard, so you may be able to communicate with someone in an adjoining cage. And so there's much less isolation than there was. I believe that when we started out, there were about 4,500 prisoners in California who were housed in a SHU, and now it's down to a few hundred. So, a few hundred, and for specific terms.
And did they find that there was any difference in outcome? I mean, in other words...
I think Danny's going to speak before we go for questions, but actually one of the things that the short corridor, oops.
Mike's unplugged now, so.
I think you can go on in your normal voice.
Wait, these mics, there's still a lot of mics somewhere.
Can you just, maybe just speak about it for a while?
Okay, so one of the things that the Short Corridor Collective did in the context of the 2013 hunger strike was issue an agreement to end hostilities. And it was signed by representatives of each of the four groups that I mentioned earlier. And it's actually had a remarkable impact throughout the prison system. There's much less interracial violence in the prisons than there was historically. Turn it over to Dave.
That's like something in the mic, right?
Unless you want to just hold it.
So, in 2003, I was in High Desert State Prison, and I was put under investigation by the Institutional Gang Investigator. High Desert State Prison is located, it's the second northernmost prison in California. It's about 90 miles northwest of Reno, Nevada, in Susanville, California, or what people describe as Prison Town, USA. There's actually a documentary like that. Anyways, I was there in 2003, and I got put under investigation because someone felt that he was in fear of his life, and decided to call the prison guard or give up information about me and other people, right? And I got put under investigation. And part of that investigation was that they took away all my property. And about 3 weeks later, they come and tell me that I had been found guilty of being an associate to a prison gang. And the evidence that they used against me was, 1, the confidential informant, 2, a calendar that my mother sent me from the street, and she would send to me every year. And it was a calendar with drawings of Aztec and Mayan culture. And these drawings were drawings that were donated by people in Vatican Beach to an organization in Los Angeles, and they would put these calendars together and sell them at the swap meet. By, you know, where I did, I was the swap meet there, and my mother would always, every year she would always buy these calendars, right? And she would send them to me. They would let them come in, and they would let me have it, right? It wasn't, so that, and then there was also a piece of literature, a newsletter from an organization in San Diego known as the Chicano Mexicano Prison Project. And they were a prison abolitionist organization. And their symbol, or their logo, was the symbol of the Mexican flag. And they used that, the Mexican flag, as evidence of my gang association. Right? So these were the 3 items that they used against me to label me an associate to a prison gang. Right? No evidence of me hurting anybody, no evidence of like me physically, attacking someone or having a weapon in my cell or having drugs in my cell. Just these frivolous items of information being used to validate me as an associate. Right? And also something that I guess you guys mentioned was that the criteria to find somebody guilty is 1,500 items. And all you need is 3 of those. There's 1,500 items that they can use to validate you as an associate or a member to a prison gang. Right? And out of those 1,500, they only need 3. So they're shooting fish in the bucket, right? Yes, so anyway, I got found guilty in the summer of 2003. Then I got placed in administrative segregation, which is an isolation unit within that prison in High Desert. Then I got transferred about 8 months later to Tehachapi. And I'm from LA. So when I went to Tehachapi, for me, it was even though I was in the shoe, it was a good deal for me because I was closer to my parents. Right? I haven't seen them in years. Like, and by that time, I already had been in prison 8 years. And I haven't seen my mother probably just once. Right? And so I got sent to Tehachapi, but there was nothing there. There was nothing there other than just, you get LA channel, right? So you get to watch some dogs in the lake. But other than that, there was no education. There was nothing to stimulate your mind. So I ended up spending a year there. And then the following year, in 2005, I got sent to Paddock Bay, where I stayed for the remainder of my sentence, which I ended up doing a 14-year sentence from the age of 16 to the age of 30. And I stayed in Paddock Bay, and that was in 2005. And when I arrived, at that point in my life, I was already at a point where I didn't want to do what I was doing, and when I didn't want to engage in the same activities that brought me to prison, but I just didn't know what I was going to do. I had no resources. I knew that when I came home as a formerly incarcerated person, it would be very difficult for me to get a job. The best thing that I could probably do is work with my dad's construction, where he's not even actually involved in criminal records. But lucky enough, I got placed in I don't know if all the pods were like this, but I got placed in a pod where there was individuals there who had been serving so many years, right? And some of them were never getting out. But I get there, and people really started encouraging you to start doing something, start thinking differently, start preparing for going home, right? There was even this one guy who told me, like, you're going home and fight later. If you don't start fighting now, you're gonna come back. So then I took advantage of what little resources were there at that time, right? And like Dan mentioned, people have this ingenuity of being able to create things, right? I see people used to dump M&Ms in a water in a carton of milk, but there'll be no milk in there. Dump a bunch of M&Ms, like red M&Ms, green M&Ms, all separate. Put a bit of water in there, let the color fall off, take the M&Ms out, and then use the color for water cleaning. These are individuals that are very intelligent, right? But just whenever given them opportunity to exercise that intelligence outside of their community, right? So a lot of times we use our intelligence for things that are going to end up getting us into prison, right? but anyways, yeah, people were very encouraging in terms of helping me get, prepared to come home. And I started doing my GED in there. There was this white man, the only white man in the pod that I was in. He was my GED tutor. Every day, Monday to Friday, from 5 to 7 o'clock at night, we would yell at each other through our doors, going over each problem on our pre-test. It took me about 8 months before I really felt comfortable to take the GED test, right? I've always loved learning. I just I don't like institutional settings, whether it's a prison or junior high, high school. These were not places where I was always recognized as a human being, right? I was always treated less than and looked down on, right? So for me, that's one of the reasons I never really engaged in education, right? But I love learning. I love reading books. I love reading history. But anyways, then once I got my GED, I decided to take the college courses that were being offered there. They were offering college courses. It started in 2005. About 2008, when the economic crash happened, all courses were eliminated. And the only people that were eligible to continue to take college courses after all the programs were people that were going home from the shoot. And luckily, by that time, I was about 20 months before I was released. So I fell under that criteria, and I was allowed to continue to take college courses. But then I was moved to a place within the shoot, but it was a pod where only people that were going home, right? And for me, that was probably one of the best experiences in the shoot, because there we had people from different races and geographical locations. So we had Southern Mexicans, Northern Mexicans, we had blacks, we had whites, and everybody got along. Everybody talked to each other. I remember when I first got there, my co-defendant, who I got arrested with when I was a juvenile, and also we both served at the same time, he came to my cell. He told me, hey, Danny, if you have a weapon on you, throw it away. But ain't nobody's tripping on that. Right? If they open your door and the black man's out there with you, you don't have to do nothing. I mean, we're all just here doing our time. We're all just here waiting to go home. And for me, it was one of the best experiences, because it really allowed me to also understand why is it that me growing up, I had so much anti-blackness, right? Why is it that I was looking at a black man and he was my enemy and I had to kill him? But why? I never understood what drove me to that point, right? So that, just being in there, having those conversations with people really opened my mind, right? And I ended up spending about 5 years in Pelican issue. And I think something that I realized very early on was that place was designed to break you. Mentally, physically, and spiritually. It was designed to break you. But yet we resist that. We resist that in so many ways, right? We laughed in there, we joked around, we made food for each other. I used to make out of cup of noodles and tortilla chips and snack them. I used to make tamales for people. We figured out how to survive and how to be community. And so for me, when I came home, so I wasn't part of none of the hunger strike, right? When I came home in 2010, about a year and a half later, that's when the first hunger strike happened in 2011. And at this point, I was in community college, just trying to continue. At that point, I was already preparing to transfer to UC Berkeley or UCLA. I was already applying to transfer. I followed everything. I followed the hunger strike on Facebook, but I couldn't get involved because I was still on parole. I was still on parole, and I was on what they call high-risk control, which is they had me on an ankle monitor through GPS that they can monitor every move or wherever I go, right? And so I didn't get involved in the hunger strike, not even as an advocate, because I was in fear that if I got involved, that it would be a violation of my parole conditions. So, but I would write to a lot of people, and that was one of the most heartbreaking things, right? Getting together from people that I was doing time with, and then writing, people writing me time like that, I just lost 50 pounds, I feel like I'm dying, so that was very painful, right? And it happened 3 different times, right? Because that was the first one, right? There was one in 2012, and then the one in 2013. So fast forward, 2013, that's when I get to Berkeley in 2012. And the organizing for the third hunger strike, but that's the final one, was already taking place. I met somebody here at UC Berkeley, Mike Bishop, who was the assistant director of the Public Service Center, who was also involved in the hunger strike as an advocate. And meeting them on campus, I kind of explained to him, my story. You know, he was, I'm introducing you to someone, and he introduced me to a good friend who's like my sister now, Asade, who was also doing the same fellowship that I'm doing right now. So it's just an advocacy fellowship, and her fellowship was to support the movement for the hunger strike. And she kind of involved me in the movement and to become an advocate in this work. And one of the things that I realized after coming home, and once I got involved in the hunger strike, was the trauma that I still carried with me from being in isolation, right? So a lot of that came back just like to haunt me during the hunger strike when I was being asked to be on panels, to talk to the news, newspapers, TV reporters, and having to constantly repeat my experience in the shoot. You know, then I realized there was something wrong, so I'd go home and think, you know, I'll go home and that day, the next day, I wouldn't want to do nothing. I'd be in bed all day, not wanting to move, you know. And that's when I realized that incarceration, in particular solitary confinement, continues to impact people's life even after their death. You know, and there's some research that said that I think that for every year that a person was incarcerated, it takes about 3 years to readjust to society. Right? So imagine for a lot of people that are coming home after 30, 40 years of incarceration, what they're going to be dealing with, what they're going to be going through, right? And so a lot of the work that I do now is, you know, after I graduated from UC Berkeley and I got this fellowship, was to try to create a statewide network of formerly incarcerated students and alumni. And thinking about how can we as formerly incarcerated students and alumni who have made the transition from incarceration into higher education and have successfully navigated this institution, what role do we play in trying to engage in criminal justice reform, and trying to engage in better policies that are rooted in some type of social justice, right? So that we don't continue to impact communities that are highly marginalized and have this cycle of incarceration that continues to plague our communities. You know, and that's pretty much where I'm at right now, you know, trying to create a statewide network. And that's pretty, that's pretty much my story. Like, that shows a lot more to it, right? But I just wanted to put it in the context of my experience in solitary confinement. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to ask. Thank you.
So I'll have to speak up because our mic, I guess, is still dead, but not our voices.
Has anybody come
can work.
up with a better idea?
I can
of
go back.
handle a difficult prisoners than solitary?
Can you repeat the question?
Sure. So the question is, has anyone come up with a better idea, than solitary for handling difficult prisoners? I'd almost turn the table on that question. I was wondering if anybody's ever come up with a worse idea for handling people than solitary, because it really, as Danny says, it's a slow kill. And some of the people who came out of solitary as a result of the lawsuit, the changes, will tell you very frankly how difficult it is for them to adjust to human contact again. How difficult it is. They become kind of paranoid, they kind of worry when they see other people and are afraid of what might happen. And certainly in terms of communications is difficult. But the other thing I'll tell you is this. I probably met at least 100 people in solitary. And there's only one of those people that I would be afraid to be alone with. Okay? Literally one. Someone I've got to know fairly well through glass, who admits to killing 7 people. Kind of a scary guy. But even for people like that, you can keep them in an isolated or semi-isolated way without such deprivation, right? I mean, if you're afraid he's going to strangle someone, okay, you don't let him strangle anyone, but that shouldn't prevent him from being able to communicate with another person, even if there's a screen between them or something like that, or prevent him from having visits from family members or friends who care about him. Just, you can give people opportunities to socialize without what they do in Pelican Bay. I mean, why can't you have a picture on your wall? Why can't you have a window? I mean, talk to the people in Pelican Bay. They talk, you know, just to be able to see the sky or the ocean or a lawn. You know, it's something that they miss, to see the stars or the moon. So yes, you can have humane conditions of prison, even for people who objectively are very dangerous people.
A good example of the work that's being done on solitary confinement at a state level is that in Colorado, they've actually increased the number of behavioral like therapists and counselors who give one-on-one attention to a lot of folks that are in isolation. And I think they actually ended the use of isolation. They no longer keep people like, you know, they let them come out in groups, but they still kind of keep them separate if they're still at high risk, but they're able to communicate with other incarcerated people.
When you were in solitary, were you able to have like family visits or anything like that?
No, I didn't get over the whole time. So the question was, when I was in solitary confinement, did I get the family visit or
Were
visit?
you allowed to, in solitary confinement, I don't understand much, but if solitary confinement, when you're talking about being isolated from other prisoners, is obviously different from having people visit you.
It'll be, if you get a visit in solitary confinement, it'll be behind the glass. You'll be on one side of the glass on the phone, and your family member or your friend will be on this side, or your attorney on this side of the phone with the phone, on this side of the glass with the phone. So there's no contact, like no actual contact.
And these prisons, I went to visit prisoners in SHU in Pelican Bay. Pelican Bay is very, very far away. Many of my co-visitors were mothers with children who drove all night with their children in the car. Then you go through the process of getting into the SHU, and then you get on a bus and go to the pod where your loved one is. And then you go through another process where you supposedly might have up to 2 hours, but it's rarely an hour. And then you speak to a phone. Even if you put your hand on the glass to pretend like you're touching them, that's not permitted. I was privileged enough to go and have a sleep in a motel the night before, but most of these family members cannot afford that. So how often do you get a visit when these prisons are put in very far away places?
Pelican Bay is a 7.5-hour drive from Oakland, and most of the prisoners there are from Southern California. What Joan said, right? 15 hours.
Is close to the idea of the SHU, but Netflix has a series called Money Country, and it's about FBI agents who began sort of mental profiling people who were radical killers. You mentioned 7 They gave I don't know if you've seen the series at all. In that case, if you haven't, it won't be as helpful, but they portray the characters, the FBI characters go into prisons and interview these mass murderers. And so they portray what it's like to go into the prisons. They show the FBI agents talking with the police who were trying to solve a mass murder situation, and they are able, in some cases, to identify a person who has committed a murder and is apprehended and so on. But the pictures or the portrayal they have of the prisoners and of the prisons is pretty grim. But I don't know if it's grim or not. And so that's why I was trying to ask if you had seen it, because then you could say, well,
No, I haven't seen the show.
if you have access to Netflix, you could afford it. They have the first season and they have no seasons. It's pretty stark situation.
maybe some of you have visited Alcatraz and looked at the cell blocks there and how old and small and dilapidated they are. You go across the other side of the bay to San Quentin and look at the housing units where people who are condemned are housed. They're no better. I mean, literally, they look like 19th century prisons. Small, crumbling cells, and totally uncomfortable, cold in the winter, hot in the summer.
Was overcrowding being reduced at all? I guess there was a move to decriminalize and get fewer people sent to prison.
The question of overcrowding, I can't speak to it on a prison-by-prison basis. I know that there are fewer California prisoners now than there were 5 years ago, like maybe 20,000. So I think we're down to something like 112 from 135,000 prisoners in the state.
I'd like to speak to the prison industrial complex. We build these huge prisons, and now thanks to the likes of Dan Siegel and other lawyers and activists, they've reduced the possibility of putting people in there for life. What happens to all those empty cells and all those guards? And do you know them?
Airbnb.
When you were in prison, in regards to you being able to get adequate medical treatment, or say, for instance, you were feeling depressed because of the grim conditions, I read a lot of articles, and I try to stay appraised of the prison system in regards to different people with disabilities, but just not with disabilities either. What is happening in the prison system, understanding you went in at age 16. So what was it like when you made a request saying that you needed some help, whether it be for you weren't feeling well, an ailment or whatnot? What was that like?
It was always a process, you know, it's fill out, a form, it's a medical review, and it can take up to 72 hours before they get back to you.
Well,
That's the general population.
yeah.
Not in solitary confinement. Solitary confinement can take even longer. But then I need guys that knew how to work around that. They'll just start yelling man down and get pulled out, and then they go to the doctors, right? You know, and some people would do that all the time, and I understand the necessity to do that, right? Because they're not getting the attention that they feel that they need, right? Luckily for me, I never gotten actually sick in Rollin County today. Probably the worst was probably just I think I just went to the dentist once. That's it.
Once.
Yeah, that was to get my, I had a toothache, but other than that, there's no like, you're cleaned up, hey, it's your duty to clean up, just clean your teeth. Like, they don't do that. Yeah.
And there are awful stories about prison health care.
Yeah.
It seems like they're very lax about doctors whom they hire to take care of prisoners. And I would say some of them are not particularly compassionate or empathetic to people. And the mental health stuff is the worst because there's this very strong ethic among prisoners. You don't admit you're feeling depressed or anything else. And a lot of social pressure not to. And the way they do it is, a mental health technician will come to a cell block and yell, anybody need mental health counseling? And of course I was going to say, oh yeah, I'm feeling paranoid today, can you help me out? And so people don't respond.
The prisoner, to answer part of your question, the prisoner with whom I was corresponding asked me more than once to look on the internet and ask to see if the credentials of the nurse that they had were good. And they were not. But she was kept on.
There's a lot of articles that I post on my project having to do with the prison system and issues with the stigma of mental illness and people not getting adequate treatment, and also prisoners that came in with disabilities, whether it be amputee obesity or diabetes, not getting proper treatment for their condition they're coming into the prisons with. And I'm just beside myself with what we can do, because if everybody's having a hard time with medical treatment, that's also pretty grim results for people to be able to come back out, work hard, and be wow, you know.
It's also important to understand that a lot of people that are going into prison are already going to their trauma time.
Right.
You know, so we have, you know, I was already going to prison, being an innocent bystander in 3 drive-by shootings by the age of 13.
Right.
I grew up in a home where, you know, domestic violence existed. I grew up in a community where gang violence existed. The first time I seen somebody get murdered, I was 9 years old.
Wow.
You know, so these are things that we're witnessing and are having an impact on our lives, but yet nobody ever,
Talk to you
damn,
about
how are you doing? Like, you know, everything, like we never had that. Like we never had those types of services provided to kids in the hood. You know, so we end up, you know, re-traumatizing not just ourselves, but, you know, what is given to us, we end up giving it back. You know?
I've just become recently aware of generally how much longer prison sentences are in the United States compared to other countries. And I don't have a lot of data about that, but I mean, first of all, do you? And also, just kind of address it, and partly this is kind of the shoe question too, because it seems to me that one of the things that's baked into our whole systems, we tend to overpunish. And if you think about, you know, even the effectiveness of, you know, whatever the effectiveness is of imprisonment, but that we tend to overdo it, and then we end up in situations where people are kind of completely socialized into that system and just have a hard time coming back out. Do you,
You know, one of the benefits to those of us who've actually been involved in this work is a fair amount of interaction with people in different disciplines, including psychologists and sociologists, and a couple of conferences that we've organized, including people who are involved in prison systems in other countries. And, you know, Norway in particular seems very humane, right? That their whole orientation is that the person who is in prison is a member of the community who kind of needs a little fixing up so that they can rejoin the community. And that's really, I mean, that's their stated and actual philosophy. And, you know, it makes you wonder about a lot of things, including the pervasive impact of racism in the United States, and how particularly people of color are, they're not part of the community, right, for a lot of white people. So it's acceptable to treat them in an inhumane way. And whereas in Norway, it's a pretty homogenous society, so you can see why they've developed better attitudes. So to me, the whole nature of the prison system, including punishment, is a function of the racism that is so endemic to U.S. society.
What was your experience? Oh, sorry.
Well, I would just like to remind everybody, we don't even have a Department of Punishment. It's a Department of Corrections. And what I'm hearing is it sounds like, I mean, you're a human being. I feel like you've gotten less consideration than a malfunctioning piece of equipment would have done. Like if I have a car with brake problems and it kills somebody, I don't want to put it in the shop for 15 years and abuse, and like someone to actually do something constructive. So I guess what I'm wondering is, how would you envision the prison system in a like way that would, I mean, what would be the best elements to actually get people corrected? I mean, is it with education? It
when someone who has got arrested for murder goes to a prison in Norway, where do they put him? And he said, we put him, you know, he said he came and he talked about the facility. And it's not even a prison. They literally have trees in the facility where people can climb up the trees if they want to, right? And this is where they pick somebody when you first get to prison, whether it's somebody that committed a robbery or a murder. In the United States, if somebody commits a murder, they're going to put him in one of the maximum security based on his sentence. If you got a 25-year life, they're going to put you in one of the most difficult prisons that they can, that exist, right? And then you have to work your way down to a minimum security. In Norway, they literally start off in a minimum security and they stay there. They don't have prison cells. They have apartments with the kitchen, with the living room, with the restroom, with separate room compartments in this apartment, as opposed to like being in a cell in prison where your toilet's right there and your dinner tables right there. You know? So I guess basic treatment, right? But even what leads the country to incarcerate so many people to begin with? That's what I want to address, right? Instead of addressing, let's create better conditions in prison. No, let's create better conditions in society so that people don't end up in prison.
There was an article in the paper this morning about kids who are, I forget what the term is now, when they're kicked out of school, suspended, and how disproportionate it is, again, based on race, how many kids get, and particularly in rural areas. And that the kids, and that they're really seeing in kindergarten through third grade, that it starts because the kids are, as you said, you're traumatized by what you grew up in your environment. And just that there aren't any resources for helping the kids in their communities at this point. And it just, it does, it's bigger, it is, part of racial things. That's certainly not GDI. We talk about the new form of slavery and how can we help kids at a younger age?
There's a report a few years back from the California Corrections Association, the third prison, that said that if a child is not at a reading level by the 4th grade, that they're destined to end up in prison. So that based on that projection, they think of how many prisons they need to build.
Well, the other problems you bring up in our school systems, we have states that still practice corporal punishment. A National Council on Disability and other organizations report came out making a statement. Yes, it is racial. Persons also, people with disabilities and different kids are also the same ones that are being affected. So they're not getting what they need in the school system. Instead, they're going through different practices of corporal punishment in this type of setting. And then we're wondering why somebody doesn't go commit a crime. Many of these individuals are people that are in poor communities. And on an intersectionality sort of look at it, that's one of the things, is low income as well. Yeah.
I might ask your experience in the College community in Berkeley, and if there was support for you, or how you're coming out of a horrible situation and going into a place where, they're 18 and 19-year-olds.
Right. I think for me, community college, I started community college about 6 months after I got out. I got out January 19th of 2010, and I just missed the spring enrollment deadline. I tried to enroll. If I would have been doing like 2 days before the day I went to campus, I would have probably been spring enrollment, but I didn't. And I didn't start until 6 months later. And during that time, I was working at a warehouse unloading boxes by the LA Harbor. I would unload like 10 trailers a day, like these big long trailers with boxes coming from China, right? And but when I would go to work, I would always go to campus. I would always go to campus and just to do walking counseling with the counselor, talk to somebody, and try to build connections, right? And hopefully find a counselor that I can see myself in and be able to be able to talk to about my experience. It's not like I went in and I started telling people like, I'm formally incarcerated, I kind of reserved that, right? Until I found someone that I could trust. But lucky enough, one day I ran into a friend who was also formerly incarcerated and did like 9 years, somebody that I grew up with, and we started talking, and he was there to pick up his degree. He had just graduated and he was on the way to Irvine, wanted to do pre-med and wanted to be a brain surgeon, right? And to me that was amazing, because I know this guy since we were kids. Like, I used to see this guy steal cars in less than 60 seconds. Like, he'll have it wired up and ready to go. And when he told me that he wanted to be a brain surgeon, I was like, well, all you're doing is wiring stuff. You might have to do more studying, yeah, you might have to do more studying, but this is something that you can learn, because this guy was very intelligent, and he already had an understanding of how to do, like, the technical stuff, right? So it's just a matter of him being exposed to more knowledge, and he'd probably be able to do the brain surgery stuff, right? But anyways, it was him. He told me, look, Danny, at that point I just wanted to get my AA degree and just try to get a job. But he told me, look, Danny, if you want to get your AA degree, that's cool, but keep your options open. You can go to Cal State, you can go to UC, you can transfer to get your bachelor's, your master's, your PhD. And he kind of just pretty much told me what I needed to do. You know, get involved in student life, get involved in student organizing, get involved in student government, get involved in the Honor Scholars Program, the Puente Program, EOPS, visit the Writing Center, visit the Math Center. And for me, that's what I did. Like, I literally used the campus as my sanctuary, and I would be there from 7 in the morning to 10 o'clock at night. And I wanted, you know, I was going to go to sleep. And I'll go home at 12 and 5 just to go eat, and I'll go back to campus, and once they shut down the campus, that's when I would go home. And I did that for numerous reasons, right? One, because I really wanted to be on campus, but also coming home to my mom's, you know, my mom still lives in the same home, the same community that I grew up in, right, where I experienced all this trauma. And one of the things that I realized in prison, one thing that they don't take away from you, they take away your property, they take away your freedom, and sometimes they even try to take your dignity. But what they don't do, they don't take away your memories. And I used to sit myself thinking about all the stuff that I was exposed to, the good and the bad, and realize that at my home I was exposed to a lot of bad things. And when I come home, these memories are just like front and center. I can feel them, right? Like I can see my friend that, you know, I grew up with, but now he's been murdered. You know, I can see my brother. My brother was murdered in 2000. In 2000, after he was deported. He was deported, got arrested, got deported. He was firstly in PJ, he was murdered. You know, and these are memories that I have, you know, ingrained in my mind, right? And that's why I come home and I start reliving a lot of this trauma. So for me, like, I go home, I go to my mom's house, and there's just something about that place that it sat the energy out of me, it just sat the life out of me. So for me, because I couldn't live anywhere else, I would stay on campus all day. You know, and it was on campus where I was able to build a support system. My English professor, my tutors, my counselors, you know, people there that genuinely took an interest in me and wanted to see me succeed, which was very different from when I was going to school in elementary, junior high, and high school, where like I was literally being dehumanized and treated like I was nothing, right? And so for me, to go to an educational setting and to be received as a human being, that was, you know, one of the most, you know, crazy moments of my life.
On that note, I really want to thank both of our speakers, inspirational both of you, dedicating your lives and your hearts and minds to one of our greatest needs. Thank you all for coming.